Have you ever come across the situation where you've tried to present something to someone with proofs, evidences, everything's watertight, you've got everything in place, but they still won't accept what you're saying, continue to argue? You've seen perhaps scholars in their field presenting their expertise, their thesis to people. Those people still won't accept it. This can be quite frustrating. I'm going to present a possible reason for this today through an effect in psychology called cognitive dissonance, which I've spoken about before on my YouTube channel, and also commitment and consistency. So a great example of cognitive dissonance, commitment and consistency can be found in a story which I've read in a couple of books recently. I'll put them up on the screen here, either side of me. It goes back to 1954 and a cult that formed around the premise that the world would end on December the 21st. But the cult leader had been told, apparently by an alien from the planet Clarion, that said alien would come and pick them up in his flying saucer the night before. So everything was going to be fine. You can imagine the people that were following this cult all gathered together in one place, sold their property. You know, in order to believe in something like that, you have to fully commit. So sold their cars, their property, took their families, went to the gathering place, full commitment. And then, of course, after that commitment took place, they had, to remain consistent. Because if you're not consistent, then you're just going to look like a fool. You'll feel a fool to yourself and to everyone who you've left behind. So December the 21st came and went. Nothing happened. And you'd imagine that the members of the cult would then throw their hands up in the air and go, I've been duped. But quite the opposite happened. Their beliefs became even stronger. A chap called Leon Festinger infiltrated the group with some of his colleagues just to observe what was happening psychologically in the cult. When he saw them developing stronger beliefs in the cult after the flood failed to happen, he knew that there was some kind of underlying psychological mechanism at work. And he concluded that people have a powerful psychological urge to remain consistent, to maintain consistent attitudes and behavior. Body language can trigger the same thing, and this was mentioned again in one of the books I showed you earlier. The body language of each one of us can trigger a dissonance between what we are thinking at the time and how we're actually acting. Say, for example, you're in a meeting room with a very senior manager or something like that, and inside you don't agree with the point, but in order just to go along social proof with the rest of the room, not to appear as if you're causing any problems, you just agree. That can actually cause that dissonance of how we act and what we believe is something that we feel a very strong psychological urge to resolve. And it can result in us actually changing our attitudes to align with the way that we've acted. So now this takes me back to the initial statement at the start of the video, when we find people, after being presented with proof and evidence for our case, and then totally rejecting it. This can come from the fact that there's been a lot of investment on that other person's behalf in terms of commitment and consistency to what they have chosen to believe in, and that choice to believe in something may not be based on logic particularly, but because they've chosen to commit to it, they then desire to psychologically to remain consistent upon it. And any time the way that they act or an outside influence comes along which is at odds with their attitude or their internal belief system, there forms a cognitive dissonance. And as we mentioned, the human desire to resolve cognitive dissonance is extreme. And more often than not, the attitude will change rather than the outward manifestation. i.e., we change our attitudes to align with our behavior. Now in this case, I'm providing evidence for something, but because another person's already committed to believing or understanding something in a particular way, they'll change what's in their mind to say, no, whatever this person is presenting me is false. There must be a bias on his behalf. So this kind of thing makes it very difficult for humans to remain subjective, unless you're particularly aware of how to overcome this kind of a bias. So I just want to read something here that was in one of the books I showed you earlier. Our motivation to resolve the discomfort of cognitive dissonance becomes stronger when the reason for our inconsistency is weak. If we have a valid reason or a strong reason for maintaining our inconsistent attitude, then we can easily justify our inconsistency. So in both of the books, the authors talk about some interesting studies done with children, where there were two groups of children of the same age. Both of them were taken to two different rooms, and they were given a selection of toys to play with. One of the toys was a particularly attractive toy to them. Group one of the children was told by the supervisor, don't play with the toy, don't play with the robot. That was the good toy. They were just simply told, don't play with it. The second group of children were told, don't you even think about playing with that robot, or I will be very angry with you. So you can see in the first group, it was kind of a weak motivation. In the second group, it was a strong motivation. The response was the same from both groups of children. Most of them didn't play with the robot. Following on from this, the same two groups of children some weeks later were taken to a different environment in the same groups. The group one children were put in a room with the same toys, and the group two children were put in a different room with the same toys. And that robot was there in both cases. So in group one, the majority of the children did not play with the robot. Why? Because they only had a weak reason not to play with it in the first place. So they had resolved their own cognitive dissonance and decided that it was their choice not to play with the robot. In the second group, however, the children were told sternly not to play with the robot in the first place. So it was a strong reason for them not to play with the robot. So they had not made the decision to resolve the cognitive dissonance. I can't play with the robot, I want to play with it. Well, it's because that guy told me not to play with it. That wasn't my choice, now I can play with it. So you see the difference between the weak reason and the strong reason. So this is a very, very powerful psychological concept. We need to be aware of this in our day-to-day lives because we're constantly resolving cognitive dissonance. But it's something to be aware of. The more we're aware of these things, the more we can understand how our minds work, and the better we'll be able to resolve the situations that we find ourselves in. So in summary, commitment and consistency is very powerful, as Dr. Caldini mentions in his book, and we should be aware of it in ourselves and in others, so that when we're presenting evidence to people that they don't agree with, maybe cognitive dissonance, consistency and commitment are at play.